Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. With the first GOP presidential primary debate already behind us and the national attention shifting more and more towards next November's contest for the White House, we wouldn't blame you if you didn't have this November's major state legislative action on your radar. We just released this year's state legislative election competitiveness report, and here to help us break it down is one of the report's chief authors, marquee team lead, Joel Williams. Welcome back to the show, Joel.
Hey, Victoria. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So we're looking at this state legislative competitiveness report. That's going to be a tough word to say throughout this show. So
yeah,
give me some grace, listeners. We're just about a month and a half away from state legislative elections in 4 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Virginia. In terms of the big picture, we saw state legislative competitiveness drop in 2023 from the decade high we saw in 2019. But this year is still the second most competitive cycle we've seen since 2011. I'll also note quickly that this analysis only includes odd years when all these 4 states held elections, which was 2011, 2015, 2019, and 2023. Before we get into the weeds, Joel, what do we mean by competitiveness, and what sort of criteria are we using to evaluate how competitive the race for any given seat is?
Yeah, so to put it kind of as simply as possible, competitiveness refers to the number of different choices someone could have on the ballot in a given election cycle. So if we consider a race more competitive, it means someone will have more options to vote for. So like think about, for example, if you live in a district where in your Republican primary, there's only one person on the ballot, and that same person is the only person on the ballot in the general election, you really only have one air quotes choice, right? But if you live in that district and there's 5 people in the Republican primary, and then in the general election, there's the Republican nominee, a Democrat, an independent, a libertarian, you have far more choices. And so that would make the district more competitive.
That makes sense. And what criteria do we use when trying to determine how competitive an election is?
So first, we're going to talk about the number of open seats, and that's the number of seats where there's no incumbent running, because incumbency is typically seen as a huge advantage in an election. Then we figure out how many incumbents are running in contested primaries and could potentially lose to challengers. And then we want to see how many general elections there are where there are both a Democratic option and a Republican option on the ballot. So we take these percentages and then we average them across the state, and that gives us a nice number for that state that we can compare to other states and then that same state in other years.
Got it. And when we do that math, we come up with a state legislative competitive index, which can range from 0, meaning a state is not competitive at all, to 100, which would signify a super competitive state. Can you give us an example of what that looks like?
Sure. So for example, let's just say we're looking at your home state of Texas, and if in Texas, 20% of the seats are open, and then in the seats that aren't, 35% of incumbents face some sort of primary challenge, and then only 15% of the overall seats have both a Democrat and a Republican in the general election, we'd take those numbers and divide them by 3. So hypothetically, Texas would have a competitiveness index of 20, which means that the legislature wouldn't be very competitive. Those aren't real numbers. We won't know that until 2024, but just as an example.
Yeah, that makes sense. So without further ado, this year, the nationwide state legislative competitive index is 30.6, which is down from the decade high of 30.8 in 2019, but still the highest figure we've seen since 2011. A 0.2 difference doesn't sound like that big of a difference, so is it?
Not really. I mean, that's averaged across 3 different statistics, so we can talk about it more later. But there's like a very small increase in one category and a pretty small decrease in 2 other categories. So it just evens out.
I'd love it if we could dig into that figure a little bit more, but what are some of the big picture findings from the report generally?
Yeah, so the main thing this year is that there's fewer head-to-head matchups between Republicans and Democrats on the same general election ballot. And then there's also fewer contested primaries for incumbents in these states. But then there's also more open seat contests. So just to throw some numbers at you, 23.5% of the almost 600 seats up in November are open. And that's the largest number and percentage of open seats in over a decade. On the incumbents facing primary side, there's 119 of those, which is like almost 27%. And that's also the second highest number in the last decade. And then for contested seats by both parties, that's at about 42%. And that's also still a pretty big number comparatively across the year. So it's not quite as high as the previous high, but it's still up there.
And how do the 4 states stack up against each other? Were there any outliers among them or interesting data points in any of the 3 key categories?
Yeah, so New Jersey led the way in overall competitiveness index, and it had a score of 43. And that has mostly to do with how many Republicans and Democrats are facing off in the general election. So that's at 87%. And that's 20% higher than the next most competitive state, which was Virginia. And then Virginia was next. It has a score of almost 37. And that had almost a third of the seats up for election being open this year. And that was the highest among the 4 states. And open seats, again, is when you have no incumbent running for election in the district. Louisiana had a score of almost 29, and they had the most contested primaries at 41%. But they have kind of a unique system where everybody runs in the same primary and someone can win it outright. So that's kind of misleading in that you're bound to have more contested primaries because of that system. And then Mississippi was just the least competitive of the 4. Its index was not quite 19. So that's, there's no real notes there on that one. It just was the lowest of the bunch.
And are there any quick evaluations that come to mind as to why our analysis shook out the way it did? Why do you think these states are as competitive as our report is predicting they'll be?
Yeah, so one other aspect about Louisiana that's unique compared to the other states in the list this year is that it actually has term limits on its seats. And so that tends to have more open seats year over year than the other odd year election states, just by virtue of, there are certain incumbents who just can't run for re-election even if they wanted to. And then in Virginia, they're using new district maps for the first time since the 2020 census. So because they used their old maps in 2021 for the House elections. And so sometimes you'll see incumbents there retiring because either they got drawn out of their district or their district got drawn to be less favorable for them. Or it could be the case where 2 incumbents get drawn together in the same district. And so they either compete with one another or one of them retires or something like that.
Redistricting always making things interesting.
Oh, yes.
Before I let you go, Joel, I'd love if we could dig into each of our 3 main criteria from a big picture perspective. And if our listeners want to dig into the details, they can find a link to the report in our show notes. It features lots of charts and interactive diagrams, so it's definitely worth checking out. But let's start with the number of open seats. As you mentioned, it's the most we've seen in over a decade. Open seats, of course, means brand new representatives, and there will be 136 fresh faces in state legislatures in these 4 states. How does that figure break down between the parties, and are there any major differences between seats being open in state houses and state senates?
Yeah, it's pretty close. So there were 72 Republicans retiring this year versus 62 Democrats. So it's not a huge difference there. As for the chambers themselves, so across state houses, there's almost 25% of open seats. And then in the Senates, that's about 20%. So there's a little difference there, but it's not anything crazy.
Now, looking at contested primaries, the total number of incumbents in contested primaries, 119, was lower than in 2019, as we mentioned, but still the second highest we've seen since we started doing these competitiveness reports. Did any nuance in that data strike you as particularly interesting?
Yeah, so there's a pretty big difference in the parties on this one stat. So this time around, we're seeing about 25% fewer Democratic primaries than we did in the last election cycle. But then we're also seeing about that much more Republican primaries. I don't really know that this is necessarily indicative of national trends or party dynamics, but it's just something to keep an eye on as we move into 2024, the presidential election cycle, and see if those numbers sort of still continue or if they come back towards the mean.
How about competition between parties? There's 241 seats in these 4 states with both a Democratic and Republican candidate, which means that 58% of seats are uncontested, with one party's path clear to winning those elections.
Yeah, and there's a pretty interesting difference here as well. Democrats are guaranteed to win 138 seats, which is about the same as in 2019, but Republicans are guaranteed to win 199 seats, which is 26% more than in 2019. So they have kind of a sizable advantage when it comes to capturing these uncontested seats in state legislatures. And just overall across the nearly 600 seats up for election this year, Democrats are only running in about 2/3 of the total races in general elections, and Republicans are running in about 3/4 of them.
And then finally, what sort of coverage can our readers expect for this November?
Yeah, so we'll be providing our readers with the same great regular coverage they've come to expect on Ballotpedia. We'll have results kind of as they're posted throughout the night across these varying states. In Virginia particularly, we've got some battleground races that we're watching in both of those chambers as it pertains to the overall control of the chambers. And so we'll have more frequent updates on those races as they get called.
Well, thank you for coming on, Joel, and sharing the great research that we did in this report. And that's all for this week's episode of On the Ballot. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to drop us a review. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, if you have any questions, comments, or love for Ballotpedia, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.